it's really nice to talk about the kind of revolutionary dimension specifically, because once you think about the story through those lenses, as it were, I think you see it in its sort of proper perspective. And because that language is not sort of readily available in the way we talk about history, it's sometimes difficult to kind of capture that specificity. That's why this kind of conversation is a bit easier in places like France or even America, where at least there's a revolution that they talk about and claim to be inspired by, even if the reality doesn't quite live up to it.
That's really interesting.
Here it's really hard to get that across, even because as I think it was George who mentioned Cromwell, but you got to really go a long way back, right? To talk about revolutions here.
And I think some people have rebranded it civil war. I think even the term revolution is a little bit
the war between the three kingdoms, even
dicey.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Afe Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hokuli in São Paulo, Brazil. Today's episode is not about present history, as is our normal approach to things, but rather 18th century history. Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare spoke to Sudhir Hazeeresingh, a historian at Oxford University, and the author of a gripping new biography of the great Haitian revolutionary Toussaint L'Ouverture. So I'll hand over to Phil right now.
Well, hi, Sudhir, and welcome to Afe Bunga Bunga.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about your book, and before we get into the meat of it, could you provide our listeners with a brief overview of Toussaint L'Ouverture's life, who he was, and why he is so significant?
So Toussaint L'Ouverture was born sometime in the early 1740s on the Breda plantation on the northern plain of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which was at the time France's richest colony. His parents were enslaved and forcibly transported across the Atlantic from the kingdom of Alada, which is today the Republic of Benin. And Toussaint spent the first 50 years of his life on this plantation. I call him in the book the first black superhero of modern times because he was a warrior, he was a founding father, he was a philosopher, a liberator, and eventually a martyr. His biggest claim to fame, as it were, was that he led the 500,000 enslaved people of Saint-Domingue towards emancipation, forcing the French, who were at the time the colonizing power, to recognize their freedom and to grant emancipation eventually to all slaves in all French colonies. Toussaint L'Ouverture then freed his homeland from slave-supporting British and Spanish occupying forces, rose to the rank of general in the French Republican Army, and by the late 1790s sidelined all his domestic and French rivals, furthermore establishing political and commercial links with the USA. And I suppose his political career came to a climax in 1801, when he promulgated a Republican constitution, which appointed him governor for life, and which abolished slavery forever. And this constitution effectively made Saint-Domingue an autonomous entity within the French colonial empire. Now, unfortunately, this displeased Napoleon, who sent an invading army to reoccupy and re-enslave Saint-Domingue, and the French captured Toussaint in 1802 and jailed him in France, where he died a year later. However, the French expedition was doomed, and Toussaint's lieutenants fought the invaders off the island and declared their independence in 1804. And that is how the state of Haiti was born, the world's first black independent post-colonial state.
Clearly, the book would have been conceived and written before the eruption of BLM protests earlier this year, that have once again raised questions of racial oppression and justice in the Western world. So could you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write the book?
I, of course, like everyone, was really delighted to see the upswell in protest, but of course, I had no idea that this was going to happen. What drove me primarily was a sense of, in terms of my own research, precedents and priorities, that I had actually spent a lot of time, in fact, all of my time, researching metropolitan French political and cultural history, and that French colonial history was something that I didn't know very much about. I mean, I was about to say, like all of us, read CLR James's Black Jacobins, so I knew about the story of the Haitian Revolution and the story of its leader. But I hadn't really spent any serious time in the archives on French colonial history. And I suppose the other thing that has always interested me, two other things that have always interested me and which are reflected in the various books that I've written. One is what I would call the history of the revolutionary tradition in France, because France is a country that since the late 18th century has this wonderfully rich, powerful and diverse revolutionary tradition, which begins with the Jacobins and goes all the way through to the communists in the 20th century. So it's a very rich tradition. And secondly, I'm interested in how should I call them, big, powerful, charismatic leaders. You know, I've written about people like Napoleon, people like de Gaulle, 19th century figures, revolutionary figures. So when you put all of that together, the thing that I hadn't done was to research colonial history and colonial revolutionary history, and indeed colonial revolutionary history with a particular focus on charismatic leaders. And once you set out the equation like that, there's still many more possibilities, but the one that I landed on immediately was Toussaint L'Ouverture, because he ticks all these boxes. Yeah.
You mentioned in the start of the book that you're from Mauritius originally, and how surprised or taken aback you were by some of the immediate similarities that you saw between Haiti and Mauritius as former French colonies, despite being on opposite parts of the world, opposite ends of the world. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how the legacy of the French Empire has shaped both places, and perhaps how you feel it might have shaped your own background.
Well, it's a very interesting comparison, because when I grew up, the history of slavery in Mauritius was something that you were not told very much about, and you weren't taught it very much in school either. The kind of narrative that was given, even though Mauritius has been independent since 1968, the narrative, now that I think back at the sort of things that I learned at school, it was really a kind of very positive narrative about, the big contributions that all the different colonial powers made to, turning our island into a great and wonderful place. And, when we studied the French period, which goes from the early 18th century up to the early 19th, the French lose Mauritius in 1810. All I remember from that is learning about French governors, a whole series of governors who, built roads, etc. Slavery wasn't even mentioned. And so one of the wonderful ironies is that it took, among other things, my becoming more interested in the history of Saint-Domingue for me to then realize that there is actually a huge amount of history of Mauritius that I didn't know about. And it sort of took me back to that history too, because of course in the meantime, particularly over the past 20 years or so, Mauritian scholars have been doing a lot of work exhuming this history of slave resistance. And it is, and the parallels are there, right? So, and I think it's something that you can almost say as a general proposition: wherever there is slavery, there is resistance to slavery. And the stories about those resistors are stories that I also rediscovered, or in some cases discovered for the first time, as I was doing the work on Saint-Domingue. And the other extraordinary thing is the history of particular sites. There's some landmarks in Mauritius that once I started reading about the history of slavery, I realized that I had walked past them or driven past them hundreds of times as a kid. But there are no memorials, there are no plaques. And so I didn't know that this was a particular landmark in terms of the history of slavery in Mauritius. And it's only recently through the work of these colleagues that this has started to emerge. And of course, this is a universal story, right? Everywhere we're now trying hard in this country, in France, in America, to uncover these sites of memory and reappropriate them. So it was a very felicitous journey for me, because it, in a funny sort of way, it took me back to my Mauritian roots.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess to maybe to move on to some of the meat of the discussion, in terms of the background, or maybe setting the scene, could you tell us a little bit about Saint-Domingue's status back then in the region, and also maybe in the context of the European colonial empires as they were at that time?
So by the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue is commonly known in Europe as the Pearl of the Antilles. It's the world's largest producer of sugar, of coffee, and also vast quantities of cotton, cocoa, indigo. It contributes a massive amount to the French exchequer, and it is a place where fabulous fortunes are made. They are made almost entirely by the 35,000 European settlers who are there. Alongside them, there are about 30,000 mixed-race people. And all of the hard work, all of the labor is, of course, done by the 500,000 slaves who, by the late 18th century, have become the majority population in the colony. And so Saint-Domingue is this remarkable place which attracts attention, attracts envy, of course, of other colonial powers.
Right.
The British are in the region, and they are based in Jamaica. And particularly from the moment of the French Revolution, the outbreak of the French Revolution, and particularly the outbreak of the revolt, the insurrection of the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue in 1791, the British start to cast eyes on Saint-Domingue and hope to establish control over it. And that's something that perhaps we'll come back to. I should say, in terms of the geography, Saint-Domingue occupies the eastern third of the island of Hispaniola. And the western third, which in today's terms is the Dominican Republic, is controlled by the Spaniards. And the Spaniards are not very far. And when the revolution breaks out in Saint-Domingue after 1791, they too tried to gain control over the area. And last but not least, you have the Americans, who are becoming increasingly assertive in the 1790s, and particularly during the second half of the 1790s, they are very keen to establish commercial and political relationships with the colony. So that's the kind of broad situation that Toussaint L'Ouverture is having to deal with. And in fact, you could almost summarize his time in power and in office as one in which he has to navigate this very complicated journey, and at times placate and at times fight back against these rival imperial forces.
So I guess maybe just for our listeners, what happened in 1791? Maybe to summarize, what are the key events in this story, I guess?
Yes, so to go very quickly, what happens in 1789 is that there's a revolution in France which proclaims the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so everybody's very happy. And not everybody, but of course those who support the revolution thinks that these principles, because they claim to be universal, will apply everywhere in the French territories. Of course, the owners of enslaved people in the French colonies think otherwise. And when the news of the French Revolution arrives in Saint-Domingue, the settlers immediately hijack the revolution. They pick the parts of it that talk about freedom and sovereignty, and they create deliberative assemblies, in fact. But those assemblies are very keen to affirm that slavery is going to continue, and it does. So the French Revolution, and because the settlers are very powerful, they have a strong lobby in Paris, which is highly influential in the French National Assembly. So by 1790, 1791, the French National Assembly has basically given a constitutional basis to slavery. Right? It recognizes that slavery, because slaves are deemed to be possessions, the French National Assembly guarantees the possessions of the colonists. So by that sort of sleight of hand, the French Revolution is able to refuse to apply the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity to the enslaved peoples in the colonies. And that's the point at which the enslaved of Saint-Domingue decide that they have to take matters into their own hands. And so in August 1791, in the northern plain of the colony, which is the richest and the most fertile part of the colony, slave leaders and leaders of the enslaved populations launch an insurrection, which very quickly spreads across the whole of the northern area. And that's how the Haitian Revolution starts.
So you've given us, you already kind of gave us the kind of compressed biography of Toussaint and his leadership, his establishment as governor for life, and eventually his capture and exile to France. I was wondering if you could tell us, I suppose, a bit about how you feel that your research, the new things that you've discovered in the archives and in the multiple kind of visits you mentioned you've done in kind of different national collections and national archives, how is this altered or may alter our view of Toussaint L'Ouverture and his place in the Haitian Revolution?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I suppose I could put it in a number of different ways. One is what I really wanted to do in this book, thanks to the kind of copious archives of Toussaint himself that are, for the most part, in the French colonial archives, but also in Spanish, American, and French archives. But the first thing I wanted to do was to kind of recapture his voice, because he's left us this wonderful paper trail. And so hearing him speak, hearing him give his speeches, hearing him through the letters and administrative reports that he writes, through his proclamations, that's something which I think is very important, because when you hear someone and hear his voice, you get a kind of really good insight into who he is and how he thinks. And that's one of the big things that I hope I've achieved in this biography. Secondly, I've tried to also explain his system of power, which is a very complex one. He's not just someone who relies on brute force or even who relies primarily on the military. I mean, I have a chapter which looks at his system of government at a local level. And what you see is that Toussaint has a really quite a subtle, elaborate system in which he relies on different groups. And one of the very striking things about his system of rule is that he drew and was able to rely on the support of groups whose interests were often, you could even say, fundamentally antithetical. The big white planters loved him, but then so did the vast majority of African-born former slaves. They idolized him too. And part of the reason he's able to do that is because he's a very clever, subtle revolutionary leader, and he knows how to appeal to a sense of common purpose. And that's the great thing that he creates in Saint-Domingue. So that's the sort of second thing that I think the book brings out, the kind of distinct and a very special quality of his revolutionary leadership. And thirdly, thirdly, for the moment at least, maybe there are other elements we can come back to. Thirdly, one of the things I really tried to draw out is the importance of his Caribbean and African heritages. And this is where perhaps I part company slightly with the sort of dominant representations of Toussaint in Europe, in works like CLR James's Black Jacobins, or earlier works by French Republicans like Victor Schœlcher, who wrote a biography of Toussaint. They basically see him as a disciple of the Enlightenment, and of course he was that. But what I'm very keen to also stress is that his Caribbean identity matters hugely as well. This is someone who's a devout Catholic, who's someone whose ideas are shaped by the spirituality of the Taino people, the indigenous people of Saint-Domingue, whose ideas are shaped by resistance ideologies of runaway slaves, and whose ideas are shaped by the Vodou religion too. I mean, although he wasn't Vodouisant himself, he knew everything about that religion. And one of the things I try and do throughout the book is really to show how this helped him establish and maintain close relations with his followers. So there's that side of him, and there's also the African side, which I think very few people have talked about. But Toussaint was someone who was very profoundly shaped by the Alada culture. He spoke the Fon language. His father taught him the science of herbal medicine. A lot of the intuitions that he has about the military art, I think he gets from that sort of military martial culture of many of the African peoples who were around him. So there's that the interaction of all these different cultures in Toussaint is something that I think is very important, and it continues all the way through the 1790s, and that I think is something, an interpretation of him that I think is novel.
It's fascinating, and I have to say it is one of the elements that I was most fascinated by. Was particularly the in the book when you talk about the particular speech, the speeches, the particular kind of jokes that he brings up, or his references to voodoo when he's seeking to mobilize a particular group of people, and indeed the letters that he writes and that you talk about in some detail, the letters that he writes to the reports he provides back to France. So it was like the voice, I think the voice does come across, and it is kind of exceptionally kind of makes it exceptionally interesting to hear it. I suppose I wanted to ask you a bit more about Catholicism and Enlightenment, but before then, I suppose, could you maybe just explain a little further what is it about his background or his place that means that he's able to fuse all of these elements? How is he an individual that is able to fuse all of these elements, the voodoo elements, the ideology of the runaway slaves, the Enlightenment traditions, the Catholicism, the Alada tradition that you mentioned? What is it about him as a person that means that all of these, he can channel all of these various aspects of Haitian society so effectively?
Well, I think part of the answer is just his experience. I mean, he spends the first 50 years of his life on this plantation in the north of Saint-Domingue, and there is in the north of Saint-Domingue. I mean, the way I would present it is he comes into a political and civic culture which is already deeply infused with these different revolutionary and cultural traditions. So one of the elements, for example, that I think very clearly shapes him is the tradition which is known as the tradition of Macandal. Macandal is a leader of the enslaved populations of Saint-Domingue, who emerges in the mid 18th century, and who does practice voodoo, and who believes that the future of the colony is one in which the enslaved peoples need to take complete control of their destinies and basically kick out the white settlers. Now, this isn't an idea that Toussaint himself later adopts, but when you see the style that he uses, the sort of rhetoric that he uses when he's talking to his own supporters, you see that he borrows elements of the sort of Macandal spirituality and adapts them to his own political practice. Mm-hmm. In a sense, that's what Toussaint does all the time. Whatever he sees around him, whether it's from Europe, whether it's from Africa, whether it's from the Caribbean, he internalizes it and then picks out the elements from it that he thinks can and will suit his purpose. And adapts them accordingly. And he does the same with Catholicism. He does the same with French republicanism. And that's where I think it is a mistake to see him as just as a disciple of French metropolitan French republicanism, because on the one hand, he doesn't really see them as his superiors, because they try and lord it over him. And he's not someone who allows himself to be lorded over. But more fundamentally, and this I think is the big conceptual innovation that he makes, Toussaint is someone who really takes the idea of fraternity very seriously. And of course, fraternity has a very complicated life in France, and it eventually flames out after the fall of Robespierre. But for Toussaint, the word frère is something very, very central, and he gives it a very distinct local meaning. And that's very characteristic of the way in which he operates. So that, I think, is what he's doing all the time. He's drawing on these different intellectual, political, and cultural influences that he finds around him, and then mobilizing them to his own political purposes.
So one of the kind of tensions that I was fascinated by was, and I thought you drew it out very effectively, is the. So I mean, I suppose every school child who's done some history will know that the French Revolution is established with great kind of anti-clerical force and weight behind it. And so one of the things that's fascinating to read about in your book about Toussaint is how these elements of Catholic humanism as well as radical enlightenment kind of fuse, both in his leadership and in the kind of enslaved and subsequently free population. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the Catholic background to the revolt and to the successful mobilization of the slaves, and also the place of radical enlightenment, as you called it, in the revolution.
Yes, although I should preface this by saying that unlike a lot of what we know from the 1790s, the earlier history of Toussaint is one for which the archives are relatively silent. I mean, we only have a handful of actual documents concerning the first 50 years of his life. We don't know exactly when he was born. We don't know exactly which year he was emancipated, although we can more or less guess that it was sometime in the mid-1770s. It was only very recently that it was discovered that he'd been married twice, in fact, and had already had a family before he met the person who became his companion in the 1780s. So there are lots of things that we don't know about him, and even the records of the Breda plantation, which have survived, are silent about his real role. So what I'm about to say about his Catholicism and his embrace of Enlightenment values is a hypothesis more than, and it's to a certain extent something that I've read back from what I know to be the case from the 1790s. And of course, there is an element of danger. One has to be honest in reading things retrospectively. However, it is clear that we do know for a fact that Toussaint that there were Jesuits around the area where Toussaint grew up. And he almost certainly was in contact with them. They probably recruited him, and he became one of their, as it were, missionaries. And of course, the Jesuits are then kicked out of Saint-Domingue because they're thought to be too close to the enslaved peoples. But by then, Toussaint has already acquired this. I suppose if we wanted to put it in modern terminology, it would be, a form of, liberation theology, as it were. It was based on this, something which for the time was an absolutely revolutionary idea, which is that, all men and women are equal, right? Yeah. That is part of Christian teaching. Yeah. And of course, the French colonial authorities and the church hierarchy had to find a way around that. But for the radical element in the colonial clergy, this was something that was true and that had to be practiced. Yeah. So I think Toussaint absorbs all of that, and you see it. It's implicit in everything that he says. The Enlightenment, I think, comes in. The question there is the sort of preliminary question there is, when exactly did he learn to read? We don't have clear evidence of that either. One fairly convincing theory is that the Jesuits taught him to read. I think they may have taught him the kind of rudiments of the alphabet, but he becomes much more fluent reader only, I would think, sometime in the 1780s or early 1790s. Yeah. So there is a legend that, and it was slightly kind of paternalistic French interpretation, that Toussaint was this poor slave who was just sort of blighted. And then suddenly, sometime in the 1770s, he reads the Abbé Raynal, who writes the Histoire philosophique des deux Indes, and his mind is completely opened, and he realizes the terrible state of oppression that he's living in. And of course, Toussaint and the enslaved peoples didn't need a European philosopher to tell them about the horrors of slavery. They experienced it on a day-to-day basis. But Toussaint was very happy to go along with this story, and in fact, in the 1790s, he was very happy for his various French allies to describe him as a disciple of Raynal. But I think Raynal, the other reason that this is not accurate is that Raynal isn't actually someone who's calling for a revolution. When you read the text, what Raynal is actually saying, the text is written and addressed to French settlers, French colonialists. And Raynal is actually telling them, if you don't reform slavery and change your practices, there will be a revolution. Raynal is not someone who's actually advocating it. In fact, he's trying to stop it, right? And that therein, I think, lies one of the huge differences between even the best intentioned supporters of the enslaved peoples in the colonies and the enslaved themselves.
Just remind me, is it Raynal who's the originator of the term of Black Spartacus, the man who will avenge his race?
Yes, Raynal talks about it, and then the term is actually first used in 1796 in Saint-Domingue by Governor Etienne Lavaux after Toussaint has come and basically saved him from an attempted coup. So Toussaint is then promoted to the post of deputy governor, and Lavaux gives this great speech in the Cap where he celebrates Toussaint as the Black Spartacus. So it was a term that was actually quite commonly used to describe him in Saint-Domingue by his allies.
One of the many, among many of the kind of fascinating threads, the one thing that that gripped me in particular was how the tension between the idealism and the realpolitik of the revolution, and in particular how Toussaint kind of sought to establish more of his autonomy vis-a-vis France, but also how he had to navigate, as you've already said, the complexity of imperial rivalries in the Caribbean. And so one story that I was I thought it was fascinating, and I'd love for you to tell us about it a bit more, is when he deliberately sabotages a French expedition which is supposed to launch from Saint-Domingue to liberate Haiti, to take Haiti away from the British, and to liberate Jamaica, and to take Jamaica away from the British, to liberate the slaves of Jamaica. And it's set out by the Directory, that was the French Republican government of the day. And Toussaint sabotages it with his own kind of rationale. I wondered if you could talk us through this a bit, because I think it's a fascinating story of this navigating the kind of realpolitik and the idealism of the revolution.
Yes, it is a very interesting story, and I think it opens up some fascinating angles that illuminate Toussaint's way of thinking. Basically, the French Directory tried to export, if you like, the revolution in the Caribbean, and so they think that the British position is relatively weak, so they plan this insurrection in Jamaica, and which is not very far away from Saint-Domingue. So they train some soldiers. They send a number of people to scout out the area. And these are people whom Toussaint himself meets, and he goes along with the plan. But secretly, he's very suspicious of it. He's suspicious of it for a number of reasons. Firstly, he thinks that actually there are some people in the Directory in Paris who would not be unhappy to see the former slaves of Saint-Domingue fighting a war that they end up losing. Right? There are people who are already starting to get worried about the power of the Black Revolution in Saint-Domingue. So rather like the Directory sent Napoleon Bonaparte to Egypt in the hope that he might never return, there are some people in Paris who think the same thing about Toussaint and Jamaica. You know, let him and his soldiers go out there and get a bloody nose, as it were. So he's suspicious for that one reason. I think the other reason he's suspicious of this expedition is a more fundamental one, and I think he's right, is that winning control of the territory would only be the first stage in the battle, and that the British would continue to hold the tactical advantage because they controlled the sea. And the other thing to remember in the late 1790s is that Britain is allied to the United States. So Toussaint was genuinely concerned that if there was a Republican administration that took power in Jamaica, that it would be isolated very quickly and would end up being choked off by the other imperial forces. And I think the most fundamental reason why he's skeptical of this endeavor is because he wants to protect his own revolution. He doesn't want to jeopardize it. Of course, this is an age-old debate in all revolutions. You know, revolutions, when they start off, they have at least some element of a desire to spread themselves out. And Toussaint shares this, by the way. You see from his correspondence, including his correspondence where he talks about Jamaica, where, I quote one letter where he says to a Republican comrade of his, I sincerely hope that my Jamaican brothers will be able to overthrow the oppression that they find themselves under. But that's the other point also, that I think Toussaint doesn't believe, unlike some revolutionaries, that you can export revolutions. Revolutions can only succeed if their fundamental energy and impetus comes from within. And so for all of those reasons, he decides that he can't really allow the Jamaican expedition to work. So he sabotages it. And that one has to then also acknowledge, he does it also for good, sound tactical reasons, because he hopes that he'll be able to endear himself to the British authorities in Jamaica. And that works only very briefly, because the Brits are grateful to him for about 10 seconds. And then they revert to their traditional attitude of racist hostility.
I think this point on exporting revolution is a really fascinating one, and maybe kind of leads you to think about some of the comparisons of the Haitian Revolution with other revolutions. And I guess one thing that strikes me is how you might call them the sort of the Cromwellian elements of Toussaint's rule, which is to say how far, I guess, the republican and democratic character of the revolution were also embedded and institutionalized in the military, in military institutions. I mean, do you think there's anything to the comparison, English and Haitian Revolution,
or indeed other revolutionary national histories?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, he was. I mean, in fact, I think when you look at revolutionary activity in the High Enlightenment and the early 19th century, the sort of military component is very often decisive. So that is part of what I think is happening when we're talking about revolutionary transformation in these societies. The military becomes one of the kind of primary agents of democratic change, for complicated reasons that are to do with the democratization of the military itself, right? So that's a more general story. I mean, you see it in France. You see it in the United States, of course, and eventually you'll see it in South America with Bolivar. So Toussaint is not too dissimilar in that respect. But I think one of the things that I've tried to do, particularly in that chapter of mine where I look at his local power, is to stress that actually. I think it would be a mistake to see his rule as relying, I'd say even relying primarily on military force. I mean, the army was a central political institutions, but Toussaint is someone who I think relies on lots of different groups. He had a lot of advisors who played crucial roles in shaping his policies. When I have a whole chapter on his constitution, for example, and that's something that is crafted entirely through discussions and conversations with groups of local people that he's appointed to act as constitution drafters. He also interacts constantly with democratic institutions like the National Guard, civic associations, and municipalities. And the other thing that I found absolutely fascinating, and this is something that emerges when you comb through his correspondence, is that he's someone who's always on the move, right? Yeah. He's constantly, every day, he's meeting people in towns, in villages, and estates. He's receiving petitioners, patiently listening to their claims. And that's why all the records, even from people who are not necessarily supporters of his, show that, he retains this overwhelming popular support in Saint-Domingue right until the very end. So the sort of military model of leadership, I think, doesn't really tell us a huge amount about. I think it explains how he emerges and how he consolidates his power. But I think those crucial 4 or 5 years towards the end of his rule, something really different, and I'd almost be tempted to say something unique is happening with him.
Right.
He's creating a really different and unique system of power, which unfortunately then doesn't really go on to be replicated because of the particular trajectory that the Haitian Revolution takes after 1804. But it's really a very original synthesis, like with most things with Toussaint.
Just another element of comparative revolutionary histories, I suppose, that struck me, and I just wanted to quickly cover. But it was the descent also into once the kind of external foes have been seen off, or at least initially, the descent into fratricidal violence with the so-called War of Knives, when Toussaint has to subdue the secessionists south of the island that has been stoked up by the British as well. Then it becomes in turn tinged with elements of a race war in the south. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, it's a very complex war because it has these racial elements, but it also has political elements. A lot of the people who join Toussaint's adversary, who's a man called André Rigaud, who was a Republican general, and they fought on the same side in the early years of the revolution in 74, 75, 76. But what happens is that Rigaud is someone who is of mixed race, and he controls the southern territories in Saint-Domingue, where mixed race populations are quite well represented. And mixed race leaders like Rigaud, not all of them, because some of them actually remain loyal to Toussaint, but some mixed race leaders begin to fear what they see as the undue influence that black leaders like Toussaint are starting to exert. So that's the kind of root of the conflict, and it breaks out in 1799, and there's a 1-year fairly brutal war, which ends with Rigaud being defeated and and he goes into exile. I think the way to see this civil war, and I think civil wars in general, civil conflicts, post-revolution, after the success of revolutions, is to bear in mind that there is always an element of external intervention as well. Rigaud is supported by the Spaniards at various moments. He's supported by the British, who actually arm him. We have actually documentary evidence from the head of the British Navy in Jamaica, who actually explains, and it makes good kind of realpolitik sense, that as long as Rigaud and Toussaint are fighting each other, they won't be bothering to spread the revolution to Jamaica. So I would say a large part of what is happening in this War of Knives is externally prompted. And of course, if you think comparatively, this happens with lots of revolutions.
Yeah.
The war with the royalists is a war which is fomented by the royalists in France refusing to accept the revolution and basically betraying the revolution. And that's why the king is eventually captured and executed. Right? He literally is a traitor. And you look at the Russian Revolution, why does the Civil War break out after 1917? There are, of course, there is internal opposition, but the internal opposition is then buffeted by an external intervention.
Yeah.
When Fidel wins in Cuba, the Americans then try to get rid of him, and they don't stop. So I think what you see in Haiti in that moment of so-called fratricidal war is something that is complicated, because it does undoubtedly have some endogenous origins, which are rooted in the conflict between the mixed race people and the black leadership. And I should add one thing, which is that in the early years of the revolution, the mixed race leaders wanted to side with the white settlers against the blacks. So there's a bit of bad blood there. But I would say the overriding reason why you have this conflict is because the imperialist powers want to weaken the Black Revolution.
So one thing I wanted to kind of pick your brains about is this, one of the kind of abiding controversies, I suppose, in leftist historiography of the Haitian Revolution is how far Toussaint kind of compromised with the white planters. And you mentioned earlier how part of his political success was the ability to mediate between all these different groups, not only the slaves who were there from Africa, but also the white planters. And I was fascinated by this in particular because it seemed to me his attempt to kind of maintain relations with the white planters and also the kind of white colonial elite was testimony to his farsightedness and also his pragmatism in the reliance on their, technical and administrative capacity in overseeing the agricultural and export economy of the island. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that and the controversies associated with his relationship with the white planters.
Yes, and in fact, as in all revolutionary movements, there are different views about the way the revolution should go. And by the late 1790s, you have a strand within the Black Revolution in Saint-Domingue, which thinks that the time has come to take control of the means of production, as it were. More recently, you've had exactly the same debate in South Africa, post-apartheid. Kind of, what do you do, right? Once the majority takes power, what kind of attitude do you have towards your former torturers, as it were? And Toussaint's view was that it was a mixture of pragmatism and principle. I think principle is that I think he is genuinely someone who believes in fraternity, and fraternity always means two things for him. It means the unity of the Black people, but it also means building a political community in which everyone, whether they're white, mixed race, or Black, can live under civic equality, and it is a real genuine part of his vision. But of course, he's a pragmatist too, and he realizes that in the context of the late 18th century, independence, the idea of simply expropriating the big planters and taking control of the means of production would, in the short run, at least, wreck the economy. And Toussaint realized that it was not, that would mean wrecking the revolution. Yeah. So he was very clear for that reason that that the Saint-Domingue economy needed to be rebuilt and needed to continue to grow, and for that reason he needed the planters and the industrialists to stay there or to come back. But he has a wider vision as well, which is a vision which is rooted in the idea of autonomy, right? So that's why he doesn't want independence, unlike people like Dessalines, who eventually leads the War of Independence and is there at the end to carry the message through. But Toussaint thought that independence in that context would be a mistake, because it would immediately unite all the imperial powers against the newly independent state.
Yeah.
And it would make it extremely hard for such a state to become to remain viable. And sadly, when you look at the post-independence history of Haiti, it seems to me that Toussaint's anticipation was right.
Yeah.
Was correct.
Yeah. I mean, avoiding sort of, summing up the man and his context, but do you think, given Toussaint's astonishing energy, political, military skill, administrative capacity, physical toughness, diplomatic acumen, do you think it maybe reflects a wider weakness of the revolution, that so much ended up being concentrated in and dependent on the efforts of one person?
To a certain extent, I think. I go back to these early examples I gave. It does seem to be a characteristic of many successful revolutions of the period that they end up being embodied in a few significant figures. So I don't think this is something that is specific to Saint-Domingue. In Corsica you have Paoli, in Poland you have Kosciuszko. One of the things that Republicans and Democrats are trying to do everywhere in this time is to hold together these two apparently contradictory ideas, which is that the people are sovereign on the one hand, but this is where I think reading Rousseau is very important. Rousseau also talks about the lawgiver. Right? The lawgiver is a really important figure in Rousseau's political theory. And, if you read it superficially, it just seems like, it's like some kind of pre-Marxist version of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But it's actually a much more subtle vision, which in many respects someone like Toussaint seems to me to embody, because what he's trying to do is to hold the sovereignty of the collective until such time as it can be fully exercised. And if you think about it like that, he is trying to do something which is very largely a reflection also of the particular circumstances that he finds himself in. And I think the debate about Toussaint's authoritarianism should not be a debate that one has in isolation. One should also always remember what he was up against. He was up against an Atlantic world where people simply did not believe that Black people had a legitimate right to exercise power in the way that he did. And there was a lot of fear and racism. And none of the elites in any of the countries that he was dealing with, right, whether it was Britain, the United States, or even France, wanted to work with him in an open and sincere way. In fact, the tragedy of the Haitian Revolution and of Toussaint is that they are becoming, the Haitians, those who are about to become Haitians, are becoming more confident, more self-assertive, more imbued with their ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, precisely at the moment when the French revolutionaries are moving in the opposite direction. Right? From the mid-1790s onwards, the revolution is becoming more and more conservative, and that's how you end up with Bonaparte and the restoration of slavery. So these are two trajectories that are not parallel. They're actually heading in opposite directions. And one has to always remember that when thinking about Toussaint. He's basically in a situation of a war leader, right? It seems to me that's the way one should think about him. He's fighting on all fronts, it's had he been operating in circumstances where all the major imperial powers were were dealing with him sincerely, then I think one could judge him by different standards. But given that he knew that the British were still out to get him, and given that he knew that the French at some point or another were almost certainly going to come and try and reconquer and re-enslave his people, I think, once you understand that, his leadership has to be seen in a slightly different way.
So I suppose one final question to wrap us up, and not an easy question, but I think the appropriate one to end on is: how far would you say that the Haitian Revolution anticipates third world revolutions of the 20th century? It's a comparison you invoke in the book, and I suppose I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about it, both not only in terms of the achievements of the Haitian 18th century, early 19th century revolution, and the third world revolution of the 20th century, but also in terms of their limits and failures. And linked to that, I wondered if you had any thoughts about how far Haiti's problems today could be rooted in the failures and deadlocks of the Haitian Revolution, the limits that it was unable to overcome.
Yes, well, I mean, starting with that, I think that's, it seems to me, a fairly, unfortunately, straightforward story, because once the Haitians get their independence, the French and indeed, one should say, the imperial powers of the time become determined to make them pay for having won their freedom. So in the mid-1820s, the French forced the then Haitian government to reimburse the planters for the slaves that they have lost. And that is a burden that the Haitian exchequer has to carry for the next 120 years. The Haitian debt isn't fully paid off until the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
So, and that, of course, completely skews the sort of choices they can make in terms of public policy. It forces them into a kind of downward spiral, which you often see with highly indebted countries. And a lot of the political instability of Haiti can be explained by that factor alone. And of course, added to that is the American intervention. The America under the so-called liberal internationalist presidency of Woodrow Wilson comes in the early 20th century and occupies and reintroduces segregation, right, in a country which had abolished it. So there is. There'd be more to say, but I think that's the kind of decisive factor in terms of explaining why what has happened to Haiti. In terms of the success, I think there is actually a much more positive story to tell. I was rereading Aimé Césaire's book about the Haitian Revolution recently, and he says, and this is where he's taking issue actually quite fundamentally with CLR James, who saw the Haitian revolutionaries as Black Jacobins, i.e. Caribbean Frenchmen. Césaire sees the Haitian Revolution as a new type of revolution, which he calls a colonial revolution. And that is its singularity. It's the first major colonial revolution of the modern era. And it's paradoxical to put it that way, because, of course, Toussaint didn't want full sovereignty. But I think if you look at Toussaint's horizon, that's where he's heading, right? He's heading in a direction in which the people of Saint-Domingue have full control over their economic resources. And the reason why he thinks France should remain the colonial power is principally to do with tactics rather than fundamental principle. But when you look at the way in which the revolution in Haiti emphasizes racial equality, I think there's a whole series of traditions that this revolution then empowers. And I talk about this in the later chapters of the book. You see that Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution remain powerful sources of ideological inspiration for slaves who are fighting, enslaved peoples who are fighting for their emancipation in the 19th century, and especially in America, of course, but right across the Atlantic. And then in the 20th century, anti-imperial struggles in Africa and even in Asia. The figure of Toussaint L'Ouverture reappears. So this is a positive revolutionary tradition. It's a revolutionary tradition of the global South, if I can put it that way. And it's not a coincidence that one of the people I quote at the beginning of this chapter, where I describe this tradition, is Fidel Castro. When he's fighting in the 1950s to get rid of Batista and this wretched dictatorship that they're living under, and he's locked up in prison after his early failure to storm the Moncada. What he says is that one of the great inspirations for him is Toussaint L'Ouverture and the Haitian revolutionaries. So that's where I would situate Toussaint in that longer tradition.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a fantastic. That's actually a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much, Sudhir, for coming on. It's been wonderful to hear more about the book and to hear some of the detail of the book. And we would strongly encourage all of our listeners to get hold of it if they can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.